no break because it's the last panel. But afterwards, right afterwards, you are welcome for those who want to stay. There will be one of the artists of the exploration space, Tamara Vukov, from the Université de Montréal, who will be doing a 15-20-minute performance up at the mezzanine in the exploration space. So for those who wish to attend, they're welcome. So it will happen just after the last panel. And because the day was long and we had a lot of a lot of content that we've listened to, we will invite you afterwards we will invite this evening the moderators to gather and to discuss with all that they've heard, and they will bring questions and a summary of today's event that will be brought tomorrow at the bridge, led by Nina Tsigledi here. So there will be a big discussion between 9 and 11:30 in the room over here as a summary of what happened today and questions that will be brought to the Media Art Histories Conference. So tonight we will not do a wrap-up session. We will let the wrap-up very open, and we will meet tomorrow again to pursue the discussion. So please welcome moderator Margrét Elísabet ÓLAFSDÓTTIR. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and welcome to the last session. I'm just going to start with our first presenter, Lois KLASSEN. She's a PhD student and a Vancouver-based artist and writer engaged in social practice. And I'm just going to make this short, and the title of her presentation is Recalling Renegade Library and Other Social Practice Methodologies from the late 1990s. So,
thank you, Elísabet. Is this working? Yeah. Thank you to the organizers for this invitation. I'm really enjoying the day. And I also want to preface this by saying this is, I'm early in PhD studies, let alone research. And this paper that I'm presenting comes from some coursework that I did on methodology that was focused on community-based participatory research, and I attempted to bring a creative project to that course, one that happened 20 years in the past. So it's looking reflectively on a long ago practice, and my study is in cultural studies. In the summer of 1998, the Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba hosted Renegade Library, an exhibition of collaborative mail art in book form. The exhibition consisted of approximately 570 book-like objects and artist publications that had been produced through various forms of collaboration. There were elaborate folios of bound correspondence, including intimate letters and artistic exchanges that appeared to have accumulated over months and years. Some of the collaborations involved numerous people who had only left a mark or two on migrating book structures that became palimpsests of found materials and texts, thickened by layers of collage. The exhibition also included self-publications in the form of zines, assemblings, and more. At the time of the exhibition, there were more than 730 individuals from 37 countries who had made artistic contributions, evidenced by their rubber-stamped names and addresses or carefully annotated authorship pages. As an overall artwork, Renegade Library was comprised of multiple actions and objects, most of which are now remembered and contained in a set of 20 archive boxes. One of these boxes, number 6, is with me here in Montreal and will later this week be delivered to ArtText, a public repository of artist books and materials covering primarily Quebec and Canadian contemporary art from 1965 to the present. In order to extend the distribution aesthetic that was evident in the way these objects were first conceived and mobilized, the current archive boxes are now destined for publicly accessible artist book collections around the world by way of personal delivery. Shuffling through the Renegade Library's pseudo-bureaucratic residue today and preparing for its transfer to artist book repositories, I realized that what was once a decidedly anti-institutional social art project is today an artifact of research creation. Though my starting point in developing Renegade Library was metaphorically and literally many miles from any institutional research setting, the project grew from my own and other participants' curiosity about the aesthetics and relational issues in contemporary art. These are now critical to current art discourses and practices inside and outside of institutions as well as the art marketplace. As research texts, 90s mail art and stories produced hybrid ethical formations surrounding care and maintenance, reciprocity, and institutional critique, formations that have relevance particularly to current forms of social art practices. Articulated after the millennial change as a social turn by Claire Bishop and others, art that aims to produce a social action or reaction needs to be reviewed in terms of its methodology and its reception rather than its representational meanings. At least this is the argument put forward by Walid Beheshti in Ethics, a new anthology of texts about the operations of artwork within their social fields. Beheshti proposes a new scholarship, one that reimagines both the ethical turn of philosophy and the social turn in art. Conflating the two in an aesthetics of ethics, Beheshti offers a way to consider current art, be it social or object-based, from the perspective of its social materialist conditions. It's through Beheshti's proposal for an aesthetics of ethics that I'm recalling the performance and experience of Renegade Library. I'm proposing that 90s mail art and other artist-run production from that decade needs to be read as performatively and socially situated, particularly for the way it carried ethical footings for subsequent and surrounding art practices. The performance of the Renegade Library occupied my art life for about 5 years, beginning with a widely circulated call for contributions 2 years in advance and spilling over into the use of the archive as a lending library that was situated in mail art networks. Following the exhibition, my work evolved into a performative role that was at times manifest in the persona of the Renegade Librarian. I recall the years 96 to 2001 to have carried a decidedly theatrical and expressionist attitude. Thatcherism and Reaganism were 6 or 7 years in the past, as was the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall. These years saw the production of the '99 Seattle WTO protests, during which we learned to articulate critiques of corporate globalism and neoliberalism, and to understand the concept of direct action. A 2015 exhibition at the Montclair Museum purports to be the first to historicize the art of the decade. Taking a Nirvana lyric for its title, this exhibition, curated by Alexandra Schwartz, summarizes 3 themes concerning 90s artists: the identity politics debates, the digital revolution, and globalization. The exhibition's promotional materials describe the increasingly heterogeneous nature of art during this time, as artists of color, women artists, and LGBTQ artists attained increased prominence. This externalized and declarative heterogeneity is an echo of words that I recall hearing from a radio commentator during the spectacular coverage of the Berlin Wall's demise. She said, "This moment has no homogeneity." The 90s was an intersectional and intergenerational time that could be seen to contrast dramatically with today's hyper-professionalized artist culture, recalls Kagan McFadden, who produced an exhibition of 90s artist-run periodicals for Plug-in Art Gallery this year. For each of the 5 periodicals that McFadden gathered in the exhibition, and another 2 that he recalled, production ended before the end of the millennium. For the Come As You Are exhibit and the Renegade Library, 9/11 was the bookend. Either 9/11 or Y2K, The post-millennial moment seemed to produce an awareness that exuberant theatricality and expressive heterogeneity were either unattainable or suddenly out of place. The term socially engaged art titles Pablo Elguera's recent handbook for practitioners and students. In it, Elguera emphasizes that much socially engaged art directly quotes early 20th century avant-garde projects. Indeed, many of the objects found in the Renegade Library deliberately reference Dada and Fluxus and other neo-avant-garde antecedents. Though interventions into the postal system had been performed by Berlin Dada artists in the 20s, 90s mail art activities were more consistent with network-generating activities of Ray Johnson in the mid-1950s and soon after by Fluxus. These artists used postal systems to send each other evidence of their art and social life and to invite correspondents to participate in thematic projects or exhibition. So by 98, thousands of artists could be reached through these lists of artists' addresses that were generated every time a mail art project was exhibited or published. Chuck Welch's Eternal Network, a mail art anthology, came out in 95, and it includes artist statements by a number of the artists who contributed to the Renegade Library. It records highly diverse approaches to the concepts of community and collectivity from well-established and growing networks. In the book's introduction, Ken Friedman, a Fluxus member, makes deliberate use of Robert Fio's moniker, the Eternal Network, to encompass all people who were actively engaged in mail art activities. Friedman writes, "This community is fluid, comprised of people who may never meet one another in person, and who do not always agree on their concepts of life and art. Those facts don't diminish the reality of an ongoing community. This is a community of people who exchange ideas, who work together in dialogue, and who have been doing so for over 3 decades. Containing a somewhat agonistic assembly of individuals whose locations, skill levels, interests, approaches to privacy and isolation were highly divergent. 90s mail art was surprisingly coherent in its operating procedures. An unofficial but ubiquitous code of practice was routinely summed up with the 3 phrases, no fees, all work shown, and documentation to all. Echoing Fluxus antecedents, this formula privileged the role of chance, a non-commercial, non-hierarchical approach. The documentation, which was meant to include addresses of each of the participants, promoted an ongoing, eternal nature of mail art activities. It also promoted reciprocity. For every action of giving away art, a recipient was obliged to reciprocate with a response, ideally one that would further the original correspondent's access to either other mail artists or mail art projects related to their interests. A text in Eternal Network by David Cole describes how the ethic of reciprocity offered renewable inspiration if one could maintain an accommodating and flexible attitude. Cole writes, "So correspondence art was a way of sharing in a community, of giving art away and clearing space to work again, of collecting related work, of hearing the communal tune, of crossing barriers, of finding stimulation, of dialoguing, trialoguing, etc. It was a mix of crossing barriers. It was a mixed blessing, of course. The network was out of one's control. One had to school oneself in tolerance, in being laid back and mellow. But there were always wonder-filled surprises, new directions, new thoughts, common sympathies." His text implies an ethical awareness of the individuals who contributed a thematic whole, a whole that was decidedly situated within the state-mediated bureaucratic industrial field of postal systems. This situated performance of exchange is best understood as a deliberate display of social and artistic contingency. I'm referring here to an analysis of socially engaged art and performance by Shannon Jackson in her 2011 book, Social Works. Leaning on her background in theater, dance, and performance studies, Jackson sees in socially engaged art a specific avowal of supporting acts. Her text contributes to a feminist critique of the usual self-governance models that get applied to art and public life. A public avoidance of support and dependency inevitably enables some individuals to claim independence while others remain invisible. In her words, public life tends to present a, quote, a disavowal of the tax breaks, military pensions, public schools, wifely labor, housekeepers, offshoring, and capitalist alienation that allows certain persons to believe themselves unfettered and individually responsible for their private success, unquote. In contrast, artists using socially engaged art deliberately revealed their project's social welfare demands. In support functions, the support functions of postal networks, as well as the hosting gallery, enabled visitors to handle and get involved in this provisional archive without the restriction of gloves or vitrines, to the extent that, that visitors could easily access the artist's mailing addresses and take up the contagion of mail art. Echoing Andrea Fraser, whose earlier performances disrupted the operations of guided museum tours, the social action of Renegade Library was deliberately positioned inside institutional systems. Fraser described her aims for institutional critique this way. If one considers practice, that is, critical practice, counter-practice, as the transformation of social, subjective, or economic relations, then the best and perhaps only point of engagement is with those relations in their enactment. The point is not to interpret those relations as they exist elsewhere. The point is to change them. If the aim of 90s male artist-run activity was to interfere with or alter capitalist expectations of public and private communications by way of art gift exchange, this action is not forgotten. In a 2007 letter to the editor of Text zur Kunst, the artist collective Scorched Earth call up this legacy to explain their current art financing dilemmas. They describe how gift economies in art demand more than conviviality, how social exchange requires anticipation of social and economic conditions. They write, "The 1990s free-for-all exuberance and its anarcho-capitalist tactics obviously have become the norm. The gift, as we understand it, does not simply anticipate the counter-gift in an endless series of convenient exchanges, 90s style. An operative conceptualization of the gift can and should anticipate its incomprehensible status for its imagined or real recipient, thus allowing for transparency in the utterly opaque conditions of exchange. Opacity of art markets and art institutions appears to be a crisis of this art era, one that's spurning another revival of social practice and aesthetics of ethics. Whether through staging art futures trading, as in a new project called Real Flow, or debt relief structures, as in Rolling Jubilee, artists are again staging social disclosures, actions that aim to reveal the maintenance systems behind corporate or state-mediated structures, are not so orientated to the avant-garde as they are to 90s artist-run activities. The carefully situated theatricality of Renegade Library and other artist-run projects performed avowals and disclosures that bear relevance for artists today."
Thank you.
Thank you.
And our next presenter is Martin ZEILINGER from Anglia, Ruskin University. He is a new media researcher, practitioner, and curator whose work focuses on the intersection of digital media art, activism, and intellectual property and regimes. And his talk is going to be about the arts makes us richer, propertization of digital art using cryptocurrency technologies.
All right. Okay, so my paper explores some efforts to engineer closed digital art markets using cryptocurrencies, specifically the Bitcoin and the blockchain ledger. And usually this is done with the goal of monetizing digital artworks that have sometimes been considered to be uncollectible or unsellable because they didn't exist as unique material artifacts. I'll introduce a few such initiatives, but mainly I'll focus on a few larger philosophical questions that are relevant here, questions that have concerned artists and theorists for quite a while. What is to be gained and what is to be lost if and when digital artworks are fenced in as propertied commodities? Can such a development safeguard the independence of art makers from the goodwill of patrons and of cultural institutions in the market? And maybe, let's not forget, will the propertization of art help artists pay their rent? Answers to these questions have been quite varied, but there's little doubt that with the rise of capitalist modes of exchange as the dominant context framing pretty much all art making and art consumption, we have had to radically reconsider both the role of art and artists in society and the role of economy in art. In digital contexts, such questions gain an urgency even more, such as now that Bitcoin and the blockchain are being instrumentalized to regulate how we might be able to create, access, and circulate digital art. Bitcoin emerged as a critique of state-issued currency following the financial crisis of 2008. And initially, it was seen as potentially revolutionary technology that might disrupt centralized banking systems. On the rhizome.org website, which is generally a pretty good indicator of what is hot and important in contemporary digital art discourse, a recent event announcement proclaims that Bitcoin technology has given rise to divergent speculations about the future of politics and finance outside of direct state control, from self-governing utopias to sublime dystopias. I actually find the idea of a self-governing utopia to be a pretty horrifying vision, and I'll come back to that. But for now, I just want to highlight that the rhizome statement is, at the very least, representative of a widespread fascination with Bitcoin technology in the contemporary art world. This fascination is partly grounded in hopes that Bitcoin technology could offer some kind of once-and-for-all fix for what has sometimes been described as the most pressing problem of contemporary art, namely the instability of the digital artifact, which has presumably kept digital art from attaining proper status in the property-based value system of the institutionalized art world. So one promise of Bitcoin technology, and in particular the blockchain, is to somehow reshape the digital into something that might be properly accepted and acceptable as art or artworks. This concern with the ontology of the digital and its relation to the material world invokes media theory as relevant for my discussion, but at least as important, I believe, is a focus on the underlying political economy of such projects, of stabilizing the digital. From where I stand, despite invocations of aesthetic theory, blockchain-based efforts to regulate digital art markets clearly delineate actually a very traditional capitalist agenda designed to create a controllable marketplace for digital art. Today, I'm just beginning to sketch a trajectory of how to critically unpack these issues, but I can already suggest that with the promise of the blockchain, history may in a way be about to repeat itself, and experimental digital art, much like the literary arts before, may soon find themselves fenced in and locked down, ready for commercial exploitation. So we need to ask what impact Bitcoin technology has on the vectors along which we define the value of art. And I absolutely want to invoke this loaded term of value in all of its connotations, including the aesthetic, the moral, the political, and of course, the economic. These connotations are being exceedingly muddled, and the history of copyright law, for example, shows us that such conceptual muddling and conflation has always been very useful in legitimizing ideological and economic structures which might, from a purely cultural perspective, be considered to be hugely problematic. So Bitcoin technology is supposed to fix in place the unsteady relationship between digitally bound artifacts and the economic, and thus to speak to the connection between the digital and materiality. I would argue that a lot of media art and a lot of analog conceptual art has always had a similar focus anyways. But surely the critical thrust that drives contemporary art's engagement with the problem of the digital is very different from the agenda that drives attempts to establish and control Bitcoin-based digital art markets. Historically speaking, Experimental art has often problematized its relationship to the concepts of the work, the artist, and by extension, the nature of creativity itself. Today, there may really not be any better medium for radically self-reflexive institutional critique than the medium of the digital, given just how efficiently the digital has resisted assimilation into major institutions of high art. For well-documented examples of this, we might look to the net art of the 1980s and 90s. Many of its best-known proponents were critically acclaimed precisely for the ways in which they turned against reactionary institutional forces within the art world, often by critically engaging the concept of the digital itself, how it might be produced, how it might be exhibited, how it might be owned, and so forth. And this usually done in order to challenge the ideologically suspect values propagated by institutional bureaucracies of the art world. The digital, in other words, is often embraced by artists because it offers a dynamic set of circumstances within which questions of form and content can be kind of exploded all over the conceptual map to enable very effective critiques of medium specificity, modes of production, modes of distribution, and so forth. And by exploring these pathways, digital art frequently positions itself as somewhat incompatible with the market logic of the art world. But now this is exactly the problem that Bitcoin technology is more and more frequently drawn upon to fix. In a nutshell, the Bitcoin system or technology decentralizes economic transactions in order to make them independent of corruptible institutional structures. The blockchain itself is a kind of cryptographically secure, publicly accessible electronic ledger, a fully transparent distributed database. Entry blocks into this database take the form of complex algorithmic chains of code, so-called hashes, that are validated by nodes in the network, which perform very difficult to solve but easy to validate operations. And this is the so-called proof of work concept. So unfakeable, unreversible, and unique identities are created for all of these algorithmic instances. Each Bitcoin is its own proof of authenticity, holding in it a digital record of every Bitcoin transaction that has come before it. And this image is kind of a fan community envisioning of the original block in the blockchain, the so-called Genesis block. Now, imagine, this makes the blockchain entries and how secure they are obviously very useful for documenting digital transactions. Now, if you imagine embedding such a signature block in a GIF, this digital artifact, which may once have been endlessly reproducible, may thus be repositioned as a unique, uncopyable item. The embedded digital signature and the public blockchain entry that verifies it can then be used to control all of the concepts with which digital art has so far had a very unsteady relationship. Authorship, attribution, ownership, licensing rights, leases and rentals, transfer of ownership, and so forth. Now, I see it as highly problematic that this promise is accepted by many in the art world with very little critical reflection. The digital is in this discourse sometimes uncritically portrayed as an existential threat to art and art makers simply because it resists assimilation into the property-based value system that dominates much of our cultural landscape. But of course, the digital isn't a threat to art at all. It's just an impediment to capital's ability to exploit it commercially and efficiently. And to fix that problem is what's now often produced or invoked as the actual promise of the blockchain. The reproducibility of the digital encapsulates a kind of a utopian idea of overabundance, but the economic value of art as commodity is always calculated based on scarcity, which in the romantic tradition is usually legitimized as uniqueness. And the blockchain can now make the digital scarce, or even potentially unique. The first project that drew widespread attention to the linking of digital art and Bitcoin technology was part of Rhizome's 7-on-7 technology art incubator series last year. The project has now become a fully functional platform called Monograph, which stands for Monetized Graphics. It verifies digital artworks using unique blockchain entries and allows artists to generate and securely embed title and license agreements in the artifact. Rhizome and the new museum have positioned Monograph somewhere between exploratory art project, aesthetic theory, and commercial product. But initially, and this is quite interesting, it was presented as a kind of a joke on the futility of wanting to undermine the uncommodifiability of digital art. Now it has clearly moved beyond that conceit. Currently, what the creators describe as the most restrictive license available to artists using the platform allows for all non-commercial use and personal enjoyment. Clearly, to characterize such an open, flexible intellectual property license as restrictive is pretty absurd. And it really only makes sense from the perspective of the potential owner of the artifact, who would be unable to control and monetize most uses of the artifact under such a license. And I think that sums up the direction in which Monograph is heading pretty well. Ascribe, the second kind of example I quickly want to give, is a Berlin-based startup working on a very similar project. And I really like the hipster appeal of their website here. The main difference is that Ascribe offers a fully commercial service by creating and controlling a proprietary database that they use for their art market. The blockchain database that they use will be public as well, because access to a digital record of uniqueness is very important for establishing economic value, but the infrastructure will be owned and controlled through Ascribe, and the company will take commissions on each transfer of title. Without doubt, these initiatives have established platforms that best lend themselves to hyper-capitalist approaches towards the management of digital assets. This continues a long-standing tradition of Western intellectual property law, in which an elite community of stakeholders monetizes the creativity of those they supposedly represent. And ever since the very first copyright statutes in the early 18th century, this has always been presented to us as being in the interest of the creators, who are, in truth, of course, disenfranchised, alienated from their creative labor, and commercially exploited. A league of literary historians, legal scholars, and cultural theorists, from Walter Benjamin to Michel Foucault, to Rosemarie Coombe, to Mario Biagioli, have all shown that the concept of authorship, as it is currently deployed, is a romantic fiction that serves to legitimize the commodification of creative practices. The legal concept of the work, likewise, contradicts the potentially dynamic, open-ended nature of creative expression, and I think this might be doubly true in the context of digitally bound creative practices. In a recently published essay titled Futures Along the Blockchain, co-written by a fairly high-profile panel of digital artists and digital art critics, the authors hope to provoke models that use the blockchain to make our lives richer. But given current implementations of the technology, I'm concerned that this statement is not at all tongue-in-cheek. Rather, it strikes me as indicative of a genuine desire for the kinds of enrichment that a proprietary digital marketplace, controlled by self-enforcing licenses, may bring to an elite of collectors. At the moment, there's only a small number of artists and curatorial collectives who engage the blockchain with the criticality that I think it requires. Further afield, the London-based digital art and theory collective launched a project called Art Data Money last month, which engages blockchain technology not with the intention of building a platform for monetization, but instead with the explicit goal of building a commons for art in the network age. In stark contrast, I think this is in stark contrast to the uses proposed by Monograph and Ascribe. The Further Field project mandate simply states, while the sustainability and legitimacy of our global systems are daily called into question, our critical artistic network cultures point to a wealth of possibilities for mutual prosperity. The distributed blockchain commons, which Further Field envisions, is only beginning to take shape. The group's insistence that we have to find radical, progressive applications for technologies such as Bitcoin and the blockchain is, I think, extremely important. A key member in the alliance that Further Field hopes to build is the English artist Rob Myers. Myers is also a prolific writer with some of the most insightful essays on contemporary art and the blockchain to his name. And Myers' artworks frequently adopt a very playful approach to engaging the blockchain. Oftentimes, he actively counteracts monetization efforts and gestures towards kind of a recuperation of the radical anti-institutional potential that the Bitcoin was originally thought to have. For example, his Facecoin work from 2014 implements an alternative proof-of-work system in which the algorithmic labor required to generate the currency is rendered worthless because it is forced to perform the act of portraiture. Essentially, the work is misusing machine vision to look for imaginary faces and blockchain hashes that are represented as bitmaps. And this is, of course, kind of a mocking reference to the art historical canon of portraiture masters, which kind of continues to influence mainstream definitions of artistic value. Myers' monkey coin also from 2014, is a clever play on the infinite monkey theorem and uses Bitcoin mining machines to search for the complete works of Shakespeare and textual representation of Bitcoin hashes. Once again, quite certainly a fruitless endeavor with very little economic value. Conceptual art famously went through a dematerialization phase that shifted both the creative act and the resulting work's reception to formalized, quasi-algorithmic, contractual gestures. I see the work of Myers and other artists like him kind of as an extension of such gestures. This development undermined art institutions and markets by refusing to yield traditional works, but the embedded critique of the ontology and economics of high art also served to reappropriate conceptual art for scarcity economics, because the concept art instructions, the contracts, and so forth themselves became ownable, alienable, unique works. Funnily enough, it is precisely the same logic of algorithmically simulated scarcity that which conceptual art played with, that now drives the application of Bitcoin technology to digital art in projects such as Ascribe and Monograph. Of course, where conceptual contract art sought to provoke conflict with the established circuits of the art market, reactionary uses of the blockchain may instead permanently forestall even the possibility of such a conflict. There's a real danger that tying digital art to the blockchain will not at all help us theorize ontologies of the digital and the value of art in a commons of networked, distributed creative expression. The specter of the smart contract is looming, and we're already experiencing it in products such as YouTube, where algorithmic artificial intelligence bots automatically enforce intellectual property policies. If self-enforcing smart contracts become tied irreversibly to digital artifacts, this will certainly have a powerful impact on how information, and perhaps ideas more generally, can be created and shared. The idea that digital art markets based on Bitcoin and blockchain technologies will empower artists and safeguard their interests strikes me as incredibly naive. Bitcoin technology was perhaps initially seen as an anti-authoritarian code that could technically disrupt the banking state. But let's not fall victim to a short-sighted techno-utopianism. Current implementations show that the technology in fact serves to expand the power of existing institutions in the high-stakes art market. Over a decade ago, the intellectual property theorist Lawrence Lessig, before he decided to run for president of the United States this year, him and quite a few other open culture theorists have begun to warn that the shifting of legal and ethical responsibilities to software will certainly not lead to a network society that is more open, more free, and more egalitarian, but rather towards a society that is more strictly surveilled and controlled, and that affords much less creative and critical freedom. If it weren't for the kind of experimental blockchain-based artworks that we are now just beginning to see, I think that the self-governing utopia which the rhizome editors are hoping for may well turn out to be just an accelerationist dystopia with really nothing sublime about it. Thanks.
Thank you. And now we want to welcome Karine Léonard BROUILLET. She is going to represent her talk in French, and she is she's doing a PhD in history of art at the University of Montréal, and the title of her presentation is Construction d'une image globale par les musées, institutions muséales et entreprises dans les années 1990.
Exactement. Est-ce que vous m'entendez? Oui, parfait. Donc, je vais commencer par remercier nos extraordinaires interprètes qui apparemment font un excellent travail, puis vous qui m'accueillez ici aujourd'hui. Donc, comme on vient de l'établir, l'art médiatique, pendant longtemps, a contourné la commodification et la monétisation qui caractérise le milieu de l'art contemporain. La simple référence de ces œuvres à un milieu technologique, pendant longtemps, les a exposées par ailleurs à une assimilation par le monde entrepreneurial, parfois même au détriment de leur reconnaissance artistique et institutionnelle. Cependant, lorsque cette reconnaissance a lieu dans le cadre conjoint du musée et de ses commanditaires, il est nécessaire d'examiner comment cette relation triangulaire entre musée, entreprise et œuvre se déploie. C'est ce que je ferai ici dans une perspective historique limitée au tournant du millénaire et dans le milieu anglo-saxon. Donc, dès le milieu des années 1990, l'utilisation de nouvelles technologies au musée est associée à son établissement sur la scène globale, notamment par l'ICOM, qui encourage ses membres à établir des alliances stratégiques avec des organisations technophiles. Notons qu'il n'y a pas encore de distinction établie entre internationalisation et globalisation à l'époque. Le tournant technologique muséal vise surtout une internationalisation des contenus dans la perspective de leur démocratisation à l'échelle mondiale. Le terme global est néanmoins privilégié dans les affirmations muséales de l'époque, raison pour laquelle je vais l'adopter ici. Néanmoins, dans les musées à vocation artistique en particulier, l'insertion de contenus technologiques nécessite une expertise que doivent acquérir ou déléguer les institutions. La présence du milieu entrepreneurial technologique au musée est donc bien sentie et ce dernier, du fait de son expertise, oriente les programmes encore embryonnaires dédiés aux nouveaux médias. Aujourd'hui, j'ai l'intention de démontrer que les institutions technologiques et muséales appuient sur l'art Internet leur tournant global ou dit global, de même que le récit qu'elles en font. Celui d'une institution qui se caractérise par le « cool » entre guillemets, un cool qui se caractérise lui-même par l'innovation et par l'émergence. Les œuvres qui inaugurent les programmes Internet encapsulent cette problématique tout en refusant catégoriquement d'en faire l'apologie. Ces œuvres Internet historiques de première génération nous révèlent par leur position critique la démarche muséale globalisante et confrontent l'affirmation de l'histoire de l'art selon laquelle l'art Internet est détaché de considérations marchandes. En détournant les notions d'innovation et d'émergence, elles déjouent les attentes de leurs spectateurs et détournent les discours qui les entourent pour s'affirmer selon leurs propres termes. Aujourd'hui, je vais me concentrer sur 3 cas où les programmes Internet ont été caractérisés par une politique de collectionnement d'œuvres en ligne et inaugurés par des commandes. Donc, le Walker Art Center, qui commande Dynamsig à Piotr Sialski, la Tate, qui commande Uncomfortable Proximity à Graham Harwood, et le Whitney, qui commande Idealine à Martin Wartenberg. J'élaborerai d'abord brièvement sur l'importance des tandems global cool et innovation-émergence au sein des musées, avant de m'intéresser au détournement qu'en font les œuvres sous-mentionnées. Ainsi, dans les cas qui nous occupent, l'arrivée de programmes médiatiques s'accompagne d'une nouvelle image de marque globale, articulée autour de l'innovation technologique comme emblème du cool, lequel constitue un attrait important pour les commanditaires. Au Walker, on souligne la nature globale du musée, et je cite, « With the introduction of the expanded website, the museum's reach will become borderless and its possibilities truly boundless. » À la Tate, le designer de Tate Online affirme, « The website was meant to disseminate the brand to a global audience and needed to build international awareness, attract visitors and supporters, and increase sales and attendance at exhibitions. » Au Whitney, le rapport annuel de 1999 stipule « The Whitney's internet-based initiatives are designed to extend public participation in the museum's exhibitions. We are confidently poised to take the Whitney into the 21st century as the internationally acknowledged leader in collecting, interpreting, and presenting 20th and 21st century art. American art, pardon. » Cette image globale repose sur 2 aspects des œuvres Internet, à savoir l'innovation et l'émergence. Les entreprises qui financent les musées orientent en effet leur propre image autour de ces concepts, comme le révèlent leurs slogans respectifs, dont voici quelques exemples. MCI WorldCom, qui collabore avec le Walker, déploie une campagne publicitaire intitulée « Generation D, It's not an age, it's an attitude ». British Telecom, travaillant avec la Tate, a pour slogan Bringing Innovation and Technology Together. Et finalement, France Télécom, qui financera en partie la Biennale du Whitney, présente les slogans suivants. Et si vous communiquiez avec les outils d'aujourd'hui, nous allons vous faire aimer l'an 2000 et bienvenue dans la vie.com. Les musées, quant à eux, viennent consolider leur image globale sur Internet avec des slogans qui suggèrent une investigation plus poussée de la part du spectateur. More than a museum, inventing the 21st century, au Walker. Look again, think again, à la Tate. Et love it, hate it, don't miss it, au Whitney, par exemple. Chacun de ces trois slogans évoque un élan vers l'avant et une innovation, notamment grâce au rythme qu'induit la ponctuation, mais il souligne aussi l'importance de ne rien manquer de l'offre culturelle disponible. En ce sens, il laisse entrevoir les débuts d'un phénomène qui apparaît de plus en plus en ce moment et qu'on a maintenant nommé le fear of missing out, lui-même associé à Internet. Dans tous les cas, cool, global et technologique deviennent subtilement synonymes et c'est une association qui fonctionne. À titre d'exemple, la Tate sera nommée Cool Brand Leader of the Year. Le musée se repose dans l'image qu'il projette auprès de ses collaborateurs comme de ses publics sur l'association de ces plateformes à des contenus novateurs et émergents. Ce à quoi correspondent déjà les œuvres Internet dans l'imaginaire commun. Or, les œuvres qui inaugurent ces mêmes programmes, bien qu'elles correspondent indéniablement à ces qualificatifs, détournent le discours qui y est associé. Au Walker, Schielski présente The Unsick, The Canon Series. Il y propose 12 canons répondant à l'intervention de l'internaute qui les explore. Ici, je vous présente un exemple de l'un d'entre eux avec des images à différents stades de l'interaction avec l'œuvre jusqu'à la complétion du module. Quand on l'utilise, chacun des modules s'accompagne aussi d'extraits d'allocution par des figures importantes du monde de l'art, notamment John Cage ou Alan Capro. Il revient donc à l'internaute d'interagir avec le canon afin d'en découvrir la finalité, le moment où l'interaction cesse d'offrir une évolution. Or, le Walker se présente comme plus qu'un musée à l'époque, en disant que ces plateformes interactives soutiennent un dialogue avec ses publics. Mais l'artiste, lui, ne permet aucunement le dialogue. Au contraire, il impose une narrativité prédéterminée à chacun des modules qui soumettent de ce fait l'internaute au récit propre de l'œuvre. La Generation D de MCI, venue dans l'espace global et communal de l'interactivité muséale, se trouve prise au piège d'un module volontairement frustrant. Chaque module prend à l'époque de 3 à 5 minutes à être rechargé. Et rappelons-nous qu'à l'époque, on payait pour l'utilisation d'Internet. Les clés de chacun des modules diffèrent, de sorte que le spectateur est dans un état constant de tâtonnement qui le force à confronter les réalités du médium de l'œuvre plutôt que de glisser dans les préconceptions qui y sont accolées. Cela détourne directement les aspirations d'interaction qui caractérisent le récit global du musée et de son commanditaire. L'innovation est alors envisagée comme une recherche complexe plutôt que comme un accomplissement technologique. Ce n'est plus l'artiste qui émerge du monde de l'art, c'est l'expérience de l'œuvre qui émerge de son exploration. À la Tate, Graham Harwood présente Uncomfortable Proximity, une version alternative du site Internet de la Tate où il crée des œuvres de substitution qui tiennent place d'œuvres emblématiques de l'histoire de l'art et soumises à un collage numérique. Il y présente entre autres des composites qui incluent des photographies prises par Harwood de lui-même, de sa famille, d'éléments organiques du paysage comme de la boue, de la broussaille, des images issues d'un livre de médecine médicale. Les pages relatives à l'histoire de l'art ou la mission du musée présentent des nouveaux propos qui sont plutôt relatifs à l'exploitation, à la maladie, à la marchandisation du musée. À l'époque, c'est un internaute sur 3 qui se trouve confronté à Uncomfortable Proximity en lieu et place de Tate Online lorsqu'il tente de visiter la page. Ici, l'exemple que je vous présente montre Harwood qui amalgame à un détail de Haywain, de Constable qu'on connaît tous très bien, j'en suis certaine, des images de boue de la Tamise et d'un portrait de son père. Tate Online est alors la seule réelle incarnation de l'institution dans son ensemble, Et le site vise à fédérer sous son toit virtuel les 4 musées qui la constituent. À ce titre, la plateforme Internet est véritablement dépositaire de l'image de marque globale de la Tate et repose fortement, en particulier dans l'optique de la mise en valeur médiatique de Tate Modern à l'époque, sur les concepts d'innovation et d'émergence. C'est précisément à cette image que s'attaque Uncomfortable Proximity par sa mimique. Harwood confie que cette proximité inconfortable émane de sa révérence envers une institution aimée, perçue humaniste et inclusive, qui glisse sur son historique commercial, colonialiste et élitiste. Il réécrit donc une histoire critique où il évoque par exemple les émeutes violentes de Tuxted qui ont permis le financement de Tate Liverpool dans l'espoir d'apaiser une population à l'époque mécontente. L'œuvre impose au musée une nouvelle narration de son histoire qui détourne le récit d'une globalité cool au profit d'une critique socio-économique acerbe. En assimilant des œuvres historiques emblématiques à une esthétique de dégoût et de la répulsion, il rejette ouvertement le style léché du tout nouveau logo qui évoque lui-même l'innovation. Et du même coup, Harwood révèle la nature factice du récit muséal. En forçant le spectateur à questionner la crédibilité du musée, il le force à réévaluer les implications d'une innovation dont les sources ne sont pas questionnées et où l'émergence est envisagée à travers le prisme du conformisme. Le fait que les commanditaires du musée aient été inconfortables avec l'œuvre, au point d'imposer un délai à sa présentation, en fait d'ailleurs foi. De ce fait, Harwood détourne l'image d'un musée avant-gardiste et novateur pour suggérer celle d'une institution hégémonique et stratégique. Finalement, au Whitney, Martin Wattenberg s'intéresse directement à la question de la constitution de la collection par le musée. Dans Idealine, il incorpore des liens vers une centaine d'œuvres Internet qui semblent pertinentes tant à lui qu'au Whitney lui-même. Son travail représente par des fils lumineux la hiérarchisation des œuvres selon plusieurs critères comme le médium, l'artiste ou le thème. L'internaute peut ainsi explorer les œuvres sélectionnées au gré des rayons dont l'intensité varie en fonction de l'importance numéraire des productions qui y sont associées. Ce faisant, Idealine visualise le processus muséal de sélection, de hiérarchisation et de canonisation des œuvres. Les rayons les moins frappants signalent quant à eux que si le musée sélectionne, il laisse aussi de côté des productions dont la résonance diminue avec le temps, en reprenant une esthétique didactique qui bascule à la frontière de l'outil pédagogique, une esthétique traditionnelle donc. L'œuvre questionne les formes habituellement associées à l'émergence et à l'innovation. Wattenberg, explorant la visualisation de données à ses tout débuts, préconise une innovation technique qui apparaît dans son fonctionnement davantage que dans son incarnation visuelle. Une innovation qui, aux yeux d'un public néophyte, n'est que peu perceptible et s'aligne donc mal avec l'idée d'une démocratisation des plateformes commanditées. Les rayons révèlent par ailleurs un intérêt pour la donnée informationnelle davantage que pour le contenu thématique des œuvres, qui n'est généralement pas abordé. À ce titre, c'est la catégorisation muséale davantage que celle de l'histoire de l'art qui est prépondérante. La reprise d'une visualité qui évoque les lignes du temps confronte le spectateur à une histoire en train de s'écrire. L'œuvre de Wattenberg est une visualisation de la réalité de l'époque, un instantané fragmentaire qui révèle cependant à son spectateur que les artistes émergents sont en réalité en dehors de l'espace muséal qui les signale et que c'est là que se trouve réellement l'innovation. En reprenant les gestes muséaux, l'œuvre signale le geste muséal comme nécessaire mais factice dans son ambition d'émergence novatrice. En résumé, je soutiens que les institutions technologiques et muséales appuient sur leur Internet leur tournant global et le récit qu'elles en font en associant les couples cool global et innovation-émergence. Les œuvres qui inaugurent ces programmes Internet encapsulent cette problématique tout en refusant d'en faire la plaidoirie. Elles détournent les discours institutionnels en déjouant les attentes des internautes et en refusant l'adéquation entre image de marque globale et programme médiatique. Elles le font de 2 principales manières. Premièrement, en se posant comme commentaire, au sujet de leurs propres conditions d'émergence qu'elles révèlent et critiquent. Deuxièmement, et cela m'apparaît particulièrement innovant, en énonçant un propos sur leur propre positionnement, présent et futur, en regard des thématiques d'innovation et d'émergence qui animent le musée. Ces œuvres Internet de première génération nous révèlent du même coup, par leur position critique, la démarche muséale globalisante dans laquelle elles s'inscrivent. Elles nous offrent de ce fait un aperçu essentiel sur des enjeux qui animent et qui animeront certainement encore l'espace muséal à l'ère d'Internet. Des enjeux qu'il nous faudra donc examiner de plus près dans les années à venir. Merci.
Merci. And now we have our last presentation by Tina Rivers Ryan. She's an art historian and a critic specializing in modern and contemporary art. She has a bachelor's degree from Harvard University and a doctorate degree in art history from Columbia. And she is going to talk about curating humanism, negotiating the politics of new media, 1965-2015.
Great, thank you for that introduction.
Sorry, I'm short-cutting.
Congratulations to the organizers for putting together a panel that's quite coherent, actually. Listening to the other talks, I realized that just like Lois, I'm looking at long ago practices and also at socially engaged art. Just like Martin, I'm going to put the brakes on techno-utopianism here. And just like Karine, I'm looking at the history of museum institutions, the recent history. Before I begin my own paper, I want to offer a mea culpa. I did something quite foolish. I attempted to fit curating humanism, politics, and new media into a 15-minute talk. So I look forward already to the questions in the Q&A period, which hopefully will push me to elaborate further on some of these concepts, which are obviously quite dense, and I'm going to be using in a sort of cursory fashion. All right. Like any artistic movement or medium, new media art is not a monolithic practice with a single origin or chronology. That said, many narratives emphasize this particular show, computer-generated pictures, the first American gallery of exhibition of images made with digital computers held in New York City in 1965, only a few months after a show of similar work that was held in Germany. Rather than going into the perhaps familiar specifics of this exhibition, I want to step back and frame it within the institutional and discursive framework of its site, the Howard Wise Gallery. What I'm going to do here in this paper is to take the Howard Wise Gallery and its activities from 1965 onwards and juxtapose it with the recent New Museum Triennial of 2015 and use these two sites as a way to think about the evolution in how we think about the relationship between new media and politics. As a retired business executive who could easily afford to treat his gallery as an experimental incubator, Howard Wise began showing artists who embraced the logic and form of new technologies as early as the 1950s, from Yakov Agam to Georgi Kepish and Len Lai. For example, in 1964, he introduced New York to Group Zero, a German avant-garde group known for kinetic metallic constructions designed to harness the energy of rocket launches for the purposes of art. Over the next few years, Wise devoted himself more and more to the promotion of new forms, from the playful, interactive objects of Julio Leparc on the left here, to the glowing, blinking sculptures of the so-called light art movement, which coalesced around his 1967 show, Lights in Orbit, and you see an installation shot of that show on the right. It was during these fruitful years of the mid-1960s that Wise began to turn his attention to new media technologies, including the increasingly ubiquitous digital computer. So while some of you might be familiar with computer-generated pictures, you may not know that in 1965 he also offered a show of works by the realist painter Lowell Nesbitt. Called Flowers, Facades, and IBM Machines, the show comprised works that replicated the quiet, objective views of everyday objects found in traditional still life paintings. But in fact, these were painted not from life, but from promotional or advertising images, and their blankness reflects the automation of knowing and seeing wrought by the computer. Now, apparently, Nesbitt was motivated to paint the computers after walking past the IBM showroom in Manhattan, which was located on the same street as the Howard Wise Gallery. So when we jump forward in a moment to 2015, I want us to remember that Lowell Nesbitt, although almost totally forgotten, is perhaps the earliest artist who attempted to reckon with the effects of digital computing, but without using computers, which is something that everyone seems to think artists only started doing like 2 years ago. By the late 1960s, Wise was presenting works by artists who worked with another electronic technology, the television. In 1969, he famously mounted TV as a creative medium, the first gallery show devoted to what we now, somewhat problematically, call video art. While described at the time as an important glimpse into the future of both art and technology, ironically, this show would lead to the gallery's closing the following year. Like many of the younger generation of artists whom he supported, Wise was increasingly frustrated by what he understood to be the dire political problems of his time. Wise was a typical progressive, liberal, leftist kind of guy. He was anti-Vietnam, anti-war, anti-nuclear, etc. At the same time, he was more and more enthralled by new media technologies, including video and also satellite broadcasts, which he understood to be inherently democratic, allowing for art to be disseminated far and wide. Thus, in 1970, Wise decided to close his gallery for essentially political reasons, writing a letter to his friends and supporters that is worth quoting at length. Before I do that, sorry, I do have a brief video of Howard Wise himself interacting with this work in in TV as a creative medium called Wipe Cycle, and this is a television bank of, or a bank of television monitors hooked to video cameras, and you could view yourself on a live feed on this television bank, and your image was actually interspersed with broadcast television, with live broadcast television. So here's what Wise wrote. It may seem paradoxical to you that at the height of the gallery's success, I am withdrawing from the exhibition scene. The most important considerations which have impelled me to make this decision are that many artists, among them some of the most adventuresome, are focusing their energies on works of such scope that these can only be hinted at in the gallery and cannot be shown or realized here. These artists are going out of the gallery into the environment, the sky, the ocean, even into outer space. Others are seeking imaginative ways of utilizing modern technology to humanize people instead of for commercial or destructive purposes which dehumanize us all. I cannot stand idly by when the existence of our society and ourselves as individuals is so darkly threatened. I sense and feel deeply the problems that menace us, but this does not mean that I am a pessimist. On the contrary, I believe that these problems are soluble if only we will use our heads and our hearts with determination and apply our vital energies towards their resolution. After all, our brains have gotten us into this mess, and our brains can get us out of it if only we use them. I intend to do whatever I can to this end. And for those of you who don't know, Wise then goes on to found Electronic Arts Intermix, or EAI, which remains one of the premier venues for the preservation, promotion, and distribution of video art. As Wise recounts, his own artist had begun taking to the streets quite literally. In 1969, the Greek artist Taki, a member of Wise's stable and a sculptor of kinetic objects powered by magnetism and electricity, forcibly removed his work from an exhibition at MoMA, launching a protest group called the Art Workers Coalition, which counted around half a dozen of Wise's artists as its core members. And I think in this photo you actually see Taki in the center here, and one of his objects to his left. Originally advocating for artists' rights, the group eventually partnered with other organizations drawing attention to the collusion of the art world with oppressive ideologies, such as sexism and racism. While this activist ethos lived on in the form of what became known as institutional critique, and also in the splintering of the radical left into identity politics, what dropped out from the conversation, at least in the so-called mainstream narrative of contemporary art, was the consideration of the relationship between art, politics, and new media technologies. Now, I'm putting Wise's farewell letter on the screen again just to indicate how explicitly Wise himself made that association. In Wise's estimation, technology is something that dehumanizes us or even destroys us. In other words, it is something that seems to be opposed to a received notion of what it means to be human, that is, to be autonomous, a rational, independent agent. But he also allows for the possibility that technology can, quote, humanize us. In other words, technology is not intrinsically bad for us. We just need artists to imagine new and better ways for us to control and to apply it. So now I'm going to skip 50 years into the future to see if perhaps remembering this part of new media's earliest history helps us better understand our own historical and theoretical moment. Just as the exhibitions at the Howard Wise Gallery in 1965 served as our origin point for new media art, the recent 2015 New Museum Triennial, entitled Surround Audience, is an equally appropriate and equally arbitrary metonym for the state of new media art today. So on the screen here, you see the New Museum's new museum on the Bowery that they opened a couple years ago, and also an installation photo of the semi-official icon of the show, and I'll talk more about her later. Now, just out of curiosity, how many people got to see the New Museum Triennial? A few of you. Okay, great. So for the rest of you, I apologize, I don't have more images, but time limits. As the museum itself will tell you, a signature initiative of the New Museum, the Triennial is the only recurring international exhibition in New York City devoted to early career artists from around the world. It provides an important platform for an emergent generation of artists that is shaping the discourse of contemporary art. The Triennial's predictive, rather than retrospective, model embodies the institution's 37-year commitment to exploring the future of culture through the art of today, end quote. And what I'm showing you on the screen are the catalogs for the first two triennials, which were held in 2009 and 2012. Now, unlike those earlier iterations, this third triennial was given a more specific focus by its two curators, the new media artist Ryan Chakartin and Lauren Cornell, new museum curator and former executive director of Rhizome, which is a new media art organization you've already heard about on this panel, and also now a new museum affiliate. While the triennial is known for its focus on young emerging artists, I mean, consider the title of the first edition, it's Younger Than Jesus, right? So nobody in the show was over 33. The fact that Chakartin and Cornell are both in their mid-30s has special significance for this particular triennial. Now, in the past few years, we've all become acquainted with the concept of the digital native, someone who is raised with computers and the internet and is therefore comfortable being suspended in their milieu, if not quite fluent in their language. While old enough to have suffered through a childhood without cell phones or social media, Chakartin and Cornell have lived their entire professional lives with new media technologies. And because of that, they've become avatars of a post-internet ethos. In other words, one that feels no need to affix the internet label to everything online, given that, well, now everything is online. And just as a side note, it feels a bit weird historicizing these curators in this way, given that I'm basically their same age, and I imagine many of you in the audience are as well. So I'm basically talking about our history and our sort of critical formation. Thus, although Cornell worked on the first triennial and Chakartin was its breakout star and has since been hailed as one of the best artists of his generation and the most consequential artist to have emerged since the 1980s, the 2015 triennial uniquely set out to locate art that, quote, vividly manifests a world in which the effects of technology and late capitalism have been absorbed into our bodies and altered our vision of the world. So this is an important point, right? In other words, for Wise, technology was something that was external to the human, something that had to be controlled and directed. But now we've accepted the radical imbrication of technology in the human, and this is a condition that the theorist R.L. Ruskin in his 1990 book High Techne describes. And so if you're not familiar with that text, that has been a very important book for helping me think through the new relationship to technology that we have today, where it's not this Hegelian dialectic of like master and slave, of internal and external, but rather it's this really radical sort of rhizomatic imbrication, to use a very overused word. All right, to give you a sense of a scope of what they found, the triennial included 51 artists and 3 artist collectives from 25 countries, covering the museum from the basement to the 5th floor. I can't possibly give you an overview of the entire show, but I'm gonna do my own very sort of hokey version of the digital humanities here and just ask you to look at a pie chart that shows the geographic distribution of the artists and also a chart showing the years in which they were born. Now, the icon of the show, as I mentioned earlier, was a sculptural work by Frank Benson called Juliana. It depicts Juliana Huxtable, another artist who is included in the show. You see her own text and photo works displayed on the wall behind her likeness on the lower right. As many critics noted, the work distills the triennial's interest in the ways in which digital technologies are crossing or even erasing boundaries and rendering forms mutable, including even that of the human body. Importantly, in this work, these effects are registered even offline, right? So even in sculpture and offline work, now we're seeing a registration of the ways in which digital technologies are radically transforming our subjectivity. Another work, a supercut of animated metamorphoses by Oliver Larrick, underscores the same point, perhaps more clearly. As the curators wrote, this show is about the, quote, energetic mutability of form, and I would add about the mutability of the human form, thereby linking the, quote, post-internet ethos to the post-human. And so now I'm just going to show you a clip of this video that I took myself, so I apologize for the cinematography. we didn't connect to the audio. That's okay. So now this piano music, this sort of like mournful, elegiac piano music, evoking what one critic called a floating, non-specific sadness, reveals that our attitude towards these transformations are far from the euphoria of some strains of the cyberpunk 1980s or dot-com 90s. In the curator's words, this results from our sense of the tension between the newfound freedoms and threats of today's society. In other words, after decades in which we tended to take very polarizing attitudes toward technology, as in Wise's own view of technology as either destruction or salvation, we now see technology with ambivalence, complexity, and nuance, as indicated by the title Surround Audience, which can refer to both the audience being surrounded or swallowed by this ambiance of digital technology, and also to the audience cohering into some kind of spatialized public. If we have revived Wise's optimism, remember that was his word, it's only as the cautious kind. And I should add that this ambivalence is paralleled in post-internet art more broadly. For example, it neither rejects nor embraces, but rather modifies the modus operandi of the art market. Now, for better or for worse, the triennial work that most explicitly connected this ambivalence about technology's effects on the human to contemporary politics was Josh Klein's much-discussed installation, Freedom, which the curators commissioned especially for the show. On the back wall of this room, we see his work Hope and Change, a video in which an actor, transformed through face mapping software into Barack Obama, delivers a far more progressive version of the president's first inaugural address, and Klein actually hired a Democratic speechwriter to compose the text. In the middle, we find 4 life-size Teletubbies dressed in riot gear. Their bellies, you guys remember the Teletubbies, yes? Okay. Their bellies play another video work called Privacy, in which retired policemen, similarly face-mapped, not to look like Obama, but to look like ordinary citizens, read statements by activists culled from social media. You also see here approximations of cell phone relay towers with credit cards for leaves. So those are the structures, the giant metal structures in the middle. These are supposed to represent cell phone relay towers. And you also note that the flooring is similar to what you'll find in corporate plazas, and specifically at New York's Zuccotti Park, which is the birthplace of the Occupy Wall Street movement. So conceptually, there's a lot going on here. The work engages the ubiquity of surveillance, the spectacularization of protest, the virtualization of control, and the force of alternative histories and speculative futures, among a lot of other ideas. But I think the most arresting and effective part of this installation is Klein's use of the uncanny body. We are forced to confront anthropomorphized television sets, militarized toddlers, ventriloquists whose faces literally slip off of them as the face mapping software fails, right? While representing with dystopian overtones the supposed permeability of the post-human, this work, with its focus on the uncanny, I think is more profoundly about reckoning with failure. The failure of the human subject to cohere, the failure of the human subject to be represented, and concomitantly the failure of conventional politics. The flip side, of course, because now there's always a flip side, right? Now we always operate in this space of ambiguity and nuance, is that sometimes the failure to cohere or to be represented is in fact a triumph of resistance. It's a way for subjects to evade surveillance or to create alternative positions in between the ones that are already visible. And this is exactly what's going on with Juliana Huxtable and the references to the Occupy Wall Street movement. How far we've come then, from the playful insertion of the subject into the open circuits of new media, which seem to promise more visibility, a multiplication rather than an internal rupturing or obscuring of the self, and also a chance for feedback and control. As Curating has said, contra Howard Wise, quote, "It's obvious that none of this stuff can be controlled, so all we can do is steer and help encourage compassionate usage and hope things accumulate in ways that are good for people and not awful." Not awful. I'll end with this hesitant rallying cry for a new art caught between the possibility and the impossibility of politics under the conditions of new media. Thank you. And before I hand it over to our moderator, I just have to show you this photo I took. This woman was walking around the New Museum Triennial with these tights on. And so clearly the New Museum's message, the Triennial's message about the permeability of the human and its relationship to digital technologies was something that people like intuitively understood, right? That she shows up in tights with like Terminator skeleton, you know, on the back. So.
Okay, thank you. How much time do we have? There are a lot of points in common in the talks we just listened to. Yeah, you can come back or whatever. But one thing that maybe stuck out for me, and I don't know if that's the case with you also, is this common question of or the relationship between the artist and the institution, or the museum as an institution, and to the capitalist environment, and to the market. And you seem to also be talking about ways in which the artist tries to survive in this environment. It seems like in Martin's talk it's kind of a thing that they want to make artworks commodity online are something to be resisted. The same way with the male artist being socially engaged and exchanging mails by like low-tech media are also a way to resist both markets and institutions. And in all the cases, which you were also talking about with the museums curating internet art in the late 1990s, and well, this turn that you introduced us to, Tina, with what the change from Howard Weiss and to recent day is, in all the talks there is this question of how to resist, and maybe the question to all of you could maybe answer it in a different way is, why is this need to resist, as in the end you always seems to be kind of captured in one way or another, whether it's by the economic system or the market or by the institutions. I don't know if you have something to say or if that makes sense to answer too. Who wants to start?
Maybe I want to start. To your point of how we're all somehow talking about resistance and artists surviving in the system, my initial kind of impetus to think about Bitcoin in this context is that it seemed to me that the alternative institutional spaces that media artists oftentimes deal with don't actually really push any sort of resistance in this context. I recently saw a presentation by the IP lawyer for a scribe at ICEA in Vancouver, and it was presented as the best thing that could ever possibly happen to digital media art, that this company, that this startup would get off the ground and begin to offer this proprietary service to artists. So, and I think I mentioned this in my presentation as well, my surprise and concern is that there may not be enough of a recognition of the importance of developing kind of resistant tactics around these technologies.
I'll maybe take that up too. That's inspiring because looking back on mail art, I'm also struck by how weak the resistance was. And I would say that it's maybe not quite the right interpretation to see it as resistant, although I want to, like looking back on it now, I want to pull out those meanings. But to be honest, people used it because they had no other way. By and large, the artists in the 90s who were using it were highly isolated in different ways that I learned. So maybe by, their subjectivity, their social conditions, maybe by geography, which was my situation. And in a way, it was like a soft out, it was easy to find people and then start networks that were under the table. And then by the time 9/11 happened, there was a lot of political protests going on through mail art, but you could tell it was a weak forum for that. It was kind of circulating messages amongst ourselves rather than truly presenting a resistant position. So I just want to throw that into the mix. And I think pulling from it now, its position socially with respect to institutions, I'm much more interested in that, to see how those artists, although it was a very, kind of a unique activity that didn't bleed into a whole lot of other social art. In fact, it did later. Those artists were really involved in social practice later. So I'm interested in that part of it.
Well, maybe just to rebound on the idea that it was somehow weak, I think also maybe it has to do with the fact that in order to have a resistance to something, you first have to come into contact with it. And for a long time, artists doing medias were not that welcome, especially in art history. They were marginalized. So even having a strong resistance was hard because you first had to come into contact, into dialogue in order to have the resistance. And if I'm taking the example of the Tate, of which I was talking about earlier, the Tate looked for artists for its first commission, and Harwood was I think it was the 8th or the 12th one, because all the other ones just didn't want to come into contact with the institution. And they said, no, we don't feel welcome, so we're not going. So I think maybe the weakness of it also had to do with the fact that the real dialogue is quite recent, at least in art history. Yeah.
As a historian of the counterculture, I'm really interested in all of the synonyms that we now use for resistance, as if we all had some allergy to the term. And we, again, I think I'm speaking on behalf of my generation, post-Berlin Wall, post-Cold War, 9/11, like creative adaptation, creative reuse, disruption, and I wonder if it's just purely, semantic difference, that we're really after the same thing, or whether we really have crossed over to this other side where we have fully absorbed the lessons of Foucault and believe that there is no outside to power and that you have to operate, only on the circuits within power. And, not wanting to, if you look at a generation of historians and art historians before us, sort of unreconstructed Marxists, that story ends badly and we want a happy ending. But it's a matter of finding a happy ending that you can really believe in, that it's not just a fairy tale that you've written for yourself.
Are there any questions in the room? This one is.
Yes, thank you. This question is directed primarily at Martin. So I'm not sure if this is necessarily a fair question, but in the interviews that I conducted over the course of the last 2 years, this idea of monetizing new media works was something that repeatedly came to the forefront as being something that many of these artists are invested in and also somewhat anxious about. And along those lines, I think a lot of the anxiety has to do with how it is that processes of monetizing and commodifying artworks will affect the creative process and then the affiliated form that their artworks take. So I think a lot of the conversation to date and the stuff that I've read on Rhizome and a bit of the stuff on Furtherfield, right, talks about a shift in the market environment around these works. I'm wondering from your perspective regarding the technical components of blockchain and Bitcoin, if you might be able to speak to how it is that those systems could have an effect on creative practice and the affiliated form that works take.
Who wants to answer?
Sorry?
Who wants?
I will answer, yes. Something I didn't have an opportunity to develop or speak so much about is the particular form that I think this technology will take when it's implemented in these contexts. And oftentimes, such as in the monograph and ascribe platforms, it'll take the form of these self-enforcing contracts and they basically automatically enforce licensed rights that are attached to these digital artifacts. And I have personally a real concern with the implications of that kind of implementation of the technology, because it ultimately removes control from everybody, including the artist, regarding what may or may not be done with these artifacts, how they may be used, how they may be changed. Well, I think I made a comment about that in the presentation, that self-enforcing, self-actualizing, kind of almost quasi-law enforcement responsibilities that are shifted to algorithms are an invisible layer that will then attach itself to a lot of digital artworks that many of us may never notice that they're there, but I think it's really problematic when they are. And I don't think personally that it would be in the interest of an artist to have that added layer irrevocably, irreversibly kind of attached to their work. That to me would contradict the idea of a commons of network creative practice. It's really the total opposite of a ultra neoliberal, ultra individualist, the extreme form of the unique artwork, digital artifact. And I cannot personally think of examples of digital media art that aspire to such an identity for their works, personally.
One more for Martin. I'll throw in a little aside. My name is Patrick Lichty. I'm a features writer for Furtherfield. And so, and actually, Rob Myers appreciated the shout out. So anyway, we were talking while you were going. So anyway, regarding, our conversation that we've had, at Furtherfield regarding the blockchain, that sort of thing, there's one thing that we're not really talking too much about. And the idea that, sure, in regards to valuation and discourses about commodification of art and valuation and even questioning it is the idea of scarcity. But there's also another one that we're really not talking about, and I kind of poke my friends about it, is the idea of antiquarianism and the long-term, archival and things like that. And, to me, I think that, the possible outcome of that is obvious, but, but I'm just wondering whether you have any input as to whether you feel, how discourses regarding the blockchain and the long-term kind of art world valuation and, do you see the question I'm getting at?
I think so.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm asking a standard Lichty question that's sort of open-ended.
Yeah.
But.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that too much, but I can immediately empathize with like where you're coming from and see that there might be a really beautiful potential for this technology to aid archival research and efforts by probably institutions, but probably also much less formal collectives or groups. So Yeah, that's not really an answer, I'm sorry, but I think it's a very interesting, it's a very interesting context that I will think about a lot more. Thanks.
Is there any other? Yes.
Sorry, another question for the cryptocurrency articulation. Thank you very much. But I wanted to ask you some very simple and a bit technical. How come that this currency is used is totally verifiable, linked to unique? To a unique person and purchase, and at the same time be used to buy drugs and weapons on deep web. I mean, how this is done, and what are the implications, the possible use of artwork in a similar way?
I hope I can answer that question. I'm not 100% secure with my knowledge of this technology myself. I would say that what these applications that I've described, sorry, I'm turning my back on you. These applications that I've described, they're not really interested in the financial value that's embedded in a Bitcoin. They're really just interested in the way it can function as a very secure form of digital documentation and contract. So that the blockchain is, may have a value ingrained in it, the Bitcoin, but it may also just have a record of who made this GIF, where was it produced and when, who was it sold to, and so on and so forth. So it can be used as a unique identifier, but you can also leave out all of this information, and so that then the technology may become more useful for contexts where anonymity is what you're after in the dark web. You're selling passports or other things.
Are there other questions by the audience? No one? Has any?
So this question is for Tina. In general, I enjoy very much the panel. I think it was a very interesting collection of presentations. My question is about what's your notion, or what is the notion that you work with when you talk about humanism in general terms? Because I think you refer to different curatorial practices, and eventually probably the link is that, but I couldn't grasp entirely, so it's an opportunity if you want to elaborate on that, please.
Thank you for that opportunity. I wasn't sure how many of you in the audience might be familiar with the discourse of post-humanism, and I unfortunately, again, in a 15-minute paper, I don't have much time to get into it, but I think essentially Howard Wise is operating within a very traditional model of humanism, articulated in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Again, I tried to gesture to that sort of parenthetically, right? It's a rational, autonomous agent, a bounded self, right? Post-humanism, there are many, many books on the subject and many different ways of thinking about it. I'm personally partial to Kerry Wolf's interpretation of the post-human, which is, opposed to some other models of the post-human, also to what he calls transhumanism. All of these practices are about imagining a new model of subjectivity, but in Wolf's articulation, post-humanism, I think, is more radical. It's not just about a subject or understanding the human as being porous and no longer sort of articulated and cogent, but actually about challenging some of the basic suppositions of humanism, so rationality, for example. I have to think more about how post-internet and post-humanism engage each other, which I think is something that's absolutely going on in surround audience and more generally is going on in 2015. But I would like to to sort of argue for this model of post-humanism that is against the model of transhumanism, which is just an unreconstructed extension of humanism, but through technology. So, you know, I'm thinking of like Stellark, you know, like where technology is used to perfect the human subject, which is this like profoundly conservative and in fact totally humanistic endeavor, I think. So I think that along with the shift, I think what I was trying to say today is that the shift that we see from Howard Wise to today involves not only a shift in how we think about technology, but also a shift in how we think about humanism, and that these things are, of course, profoundly related because now we understand the human to, in fact, be completely complicated and inhabited by technology. So these discourses are tied together, but I hope that helped. Okay.
So,
any other?
Margrét.
Yeah, you want to maybe?
Everyone
looks very tired.
I think we have had a very full panel, so I will thank you very much. I think we need to clear the room right now, so this will conclude the day. Thank you very much for all the presenters, to the moderators. And this is only the first day. So I invite you all, those, although I know it is in French only, but there is a very interesting conference happening at 6 o'clock at the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal. So those, that is a conference by Samuel Bianchini and Emmanuel Quince from ENSAD in Paris. And so for those who want, I also invite you next door because there's a few snacks, so you can pursue the discussion. And tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, from 9 till 11:30, we will have a summary of what happened today. We will have questions that will be brought to the first, to the delegates of the Media Art Histories that are arriving tomorrow. So thank you, and please come back tomorrow. Thank you.